This is also a time of change for my family.
For weeks, whispers had moved through the royal household faster than official statements, turning private conversations into dangerous palace currency. Then King Charles made one move nobody expected. With a signature and a carefully worded command, he shut down the informal channels feeding the gossip machine and placed all sensitive royal communications under one tightly controlled authority. The order was decisive. The reaction was immediate. And Queen Camilla was apparently the person most stunned by what changed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had reached the point where silence felt safer than trust. Private remarks were traveling, changing each time, until ordinary disagreements returned as palace gossip. Competing versions of sensitive conversations were reaching courtiers before formal decisions could settle them, turning confusion into suspicion. The king answered with the Crown Household Confidentiality Directive, an internal order controlling how private royal information could move. In plain terms, sensitive family discussions, staff briefings, and scheduling decisions now had to pass through the king's private secretary, the senior official managing the sovereign's core business, before anyone beyond essential personnel could receive them. Charles read the final page alone and stopped at the signature line. He lowered his fountain pen, waited, then placed it against the paper. The pause carried more weight than anger. He knew what the order meant. Offices that had relied on informal access would lose it, and people he trusted would now be restricted by rules meant to protect family peace. He signed anyway. The monarch had decided that loyalty could no longer depend on goodwill alone. Camilla received her copy soon afterward. She read the section on independent household briefings once, then again, and the meaning settled hard. Her office would no longer enjoy separate informal channels. The queen consort was not singled out, yet that was almost worse. Charles had built a rule broad enough to include everyone, leaving no room for private exemptions or easy reassurance. Then came the clause that changed everything. Every sensitive briefing would carry a record of who authorized it, creating a trail whenever private information escaped. Charles named no culprit. He did not accuse Camilla, William, or any aide. That restraint made the decision feel colder, because the king seemed less interested in blame than in making future denials impossible. Camilla finally asked who had advised him to include the tracking clause. The answer came without hesitation: Charles himself. Her silence deepened, and to understand why that answer cut so deeply, we have to look at what both of them believed they were suddenly about to lose. Royal authority may have created the order, but authority was never the most painful part of this story. Trust was. Behind the language of confidentiality sat a marriage, a family, and decades of carefully constructed loyalty. Charles believed uncontrolled palace chatter was damaging the crown. Camilla saw something more personal, a barrier appearing where access had once been natural. And between them stood Prince William, watching a private disagreement become something the institution could no longer ignore. Charles had spent years watching private family tensions become public stories, stripped of context. Small disagreements could harden into headlines, and once they escaped, the family rarely controlled what they became. That was why the king treated the new directive as more than an administrative fix. The crown, meaning the monarchy as an institution rather than simply the person wearing the crown, depended on discipline around private conversations. Camilla understood that argument, but her own position had been built differently. She had relied on familiarity, personal relationships, and the ability to sense trouble before it reached the surface. Now those informal pathways were closing. Camilla finally asked the question she had been carrying since reading the order. Sitting privately with Charles, she asked whether the directive meant he no longer trusted her judgment. He did not answer at once. Instead, the monarch folded the document shut and rested his hand over it, before saying that the rule applied to everyone. The response was careful, almost painfully so. She heard equality in his words, but she also heard distance. For her, the wound was not losing access. It was wondering whether decades of loyalty had suddenly become something that required supervision. William received the explanation separately, and he immediately understood the danger. The prince supported stronger discipline because he had seen how quickly private family differences could be exaggerated once they moved beyond the room where they began. But he refused to treat the decision as a victory. He knew every new restriction placed between Charles and Camilla risked becoming another source of resentment, and the future king chose his words with deliberate caution when he told his father that control could protect the institution while still hurting the people inside it. Charles then revealed the detail that changed the conversation. According to the internal review recorded for his private office, this was not about one embarrassing leak. Sensitive remarks had resurfaced again and again with subtle changes, making ordinary disagreements sound far more hostile than they had been. Camilla was told that several conversations involving her own office had appeared in that review. No accusation followed. That absence unsettled her even more. William finally asked when Charles had first decided intervention was unavoidable. The king gave him one specific date. The prince went quiet, because he remembered exactly what had happened that evening. The order may have been signed in silence, but its true beginning lay months earlier, when one private royal conversation escaped almost before the doors had closed. Every palace crisis has a moment that looks insignificant until everything after it is viewed differently. In this case, that moment came during a private Windsor dinner. No cameras, no public speeches, only Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, and a handful of senior household figures discussing an upcoming royal program. Yet before the following morning, part of that conversation had escaped into palace gossip, almost word for word. For Charles, that was not embarrassment. It was the point of no return. Charles had entered the evening hoping conversation could solve what formal meetings had not. The royal calendar, the planned schedule of official engagements carried out by working members of the family, had become increasingly difficult to balance. William believed responsibilities needed clearer direction as his generation took on greater weight. Camilla feared experienced advisors were being pushed aside too quickly. Catherine understood both concerns, and she watched the king try to hold those competing pressures together without turning a family disagreement into an institutional battle. William finally said what others had avoided. He questioned whether too many competing offices were shaping the schedule and weakening clear decisions. Camilla answered firmly that experience should not be discarded simply because the next generation wanted greater control. The prince did not retreat, but neither did the queen consort. Their exchange remained measured, yet the tension underneath it was impossible to miss. Catherine noticed Charles growing quieter with every sentence. When the discussion ended, the monarch pushed his chair back, thanked everyone, and left without the familiar reassuring words he normally used to settle difficult family moments. Mourning changed everything. Charles learned through a documented internal account, prepared for his private office, that a distorted version of the dinner was already moving among staff. William was being described as openly challenging Camilla's authority. She, in turn, was said to have questioned whether the future king was ready for greater responsibility. Catherine knew those claims sharpened what had actually been said. The prince had challenged a system, not her standing, while the queen had defended experience without attacking his fitness for the future. Charles compared the circulating phrases with his own recollection, and felt the real danger settle in. Several expressions were too precise to be coincidence. Someone had either carried the conversation out of the room or had been briefed directly afterward. The king did not accuse William. He did not confront Camilla. Instead, he quietly instructed his private secretary to trace who received sensitive information after family meetings. That hidden review would continue for months. Charles had found the pattern, but confronting those closest to him and forcing the palace to accept new boundaries would prove far more painful. The palace could absorb gossip. A marriage could absorb disagreement. But there came a point when Charles had to decide whether keeping the peace was actually protecting the problem. That decision brought him and Camilla into a private room with no wider family audience and no comfortable escape. She wanted to know whether the directive was really about procedure. Charles wanted her to understand that procedure had become necessary because personal assurances were no longer enough. Camilla had requested the meeting after discovering that members of her household now needed clearance before passing along information they once handled freely. The change felt immediate because those informal channels had helped her understand concerns before they became crises. Charles agreed to speak because he did not want the Crown Household Confidentiality Directive to become a hidden punishment in anyone's mind. The directive, an internal rule controlling how sensitive royal information could be shared, was meant to become permanent discipline, not temporary retaliation. But explaining that distinction would prove far harder than signing it. Camilla placed the order between them and went straight to the wound beneath the paperwork. "Do you believe my office cannot be trusted?" Charles did not look away. He answered slowly, "I believe the crown cannot survive on assumptions of trust alone." The words landed harder than an accusation. She pulled her hand away and told him that loyalty could not be reduced to authorization codes, logs, and signatures. The king understood her anger, but he refused to soften the principle simply because the person challenging it was his wife. Charles then described what the internal review had uncovered through documented briefing records. Stories had changed as they moved between offices. A mild disagreement became a confrontation. A question became a challenge. A private frustration became supposed royal warfare. The monarch stressed that the review had not proved one deliberate leak, and that was exactly what made the problem more dangerous. Nobody needed to intend betrayal if too many people believed sharing private information was harmless. Camilla listened, but another thought had already taken hold. If the king had built this system without consulting her, who had been consulted? She finally asked whether William had known about the directive before she did. Charles paused. It was only a moment, but the silence carried enough meaning. The Queen understood that the prince had at least known stronger controls were being considered. That realization changed the argument instantly. What had begun as Charles against palace gossip was now threatening to become something more dangerous. A struggle over who still possessed influence closest to the crown. A royal household is not controlled only by crowns, titles, or ceremonial rank. Information is power too. Who hears a decision first? Who explains it to staff? Who shapes the language before the outside world ever learns what happened? Charles's directive attacked that hidden currency directly, and as the new rules settled over the palace, Camilla understood why the move felt so dramatic. The king had not merely silenced gossip. He had changed who could control the story. Charles still held the final authority because the sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch who formally leads the royal household, could decide how that household operated. Yet practical influence had always been more complicated. Separate royal offices worked through advisors, private secretaries, and communication staff, giving different family members their own channels of information and persuasion. The new system did not abolish those offices. It simply forced sensitive material through formal approval, making access less personal and influence more accountable. Camilla felt the shift almost immediately. During a meeting with a senior aide, she heard frustration hiding beneath careful professional language. The advisor warned that the new controls could slow decisions and weaken the office's ability to respond quickly. She listened without interrupting, then gave a firm answer. Nobody was to challenge the king's instruction. The queen consort defended the order publicly inside her own household, even while privately feeling the ground beneath her role had changed. Charles faced a different kind of discomfort. Late that day, he received the first implementation report through his private office, a written summary showing how the directive was being applied across the household. The king saw that informal information routes had already been closed, and that sensitive briefings were moving through a smaller, traceable chain. The system was working. He leaned back in silence, knowing success had come with an emotional cost he could not measure on paper. William's position now became clearer as well. The prince had known his father was considering stronger controls, but he had never seen the final wording, and had not known Camilla's office would lose independent briefing privileges. Charles had deliberately withheld the completed directive from every family member until it was signed. The monarch wanted no bargaining, no private lobbying, and no exemptions carved out through personal influence. Then came the first real test. A fresh disagreement over the royal schedule moved through the approved circle, sharp enough to have fueled days of gossip under the old system. This time, nothing escaped. No distorted version reached another office. No whispered account began moving through the household. The silence Charles wanted had finally arrived. But when a palace famous for whispers suddenly goes quiet, silence itself can become deeply unsettling. The first sign that Charles's move had worked was not a dramatic announcement. It was silence. A sensitive disagreement over the royal calendar remained private. No embellished version appeared among courtiers. No competing explanation raced through the household. For the king, it was proof that discipline could restore order. For Camilla, the same silence felt different. Familiar conversations stopped arriving. Staff members became cautious around her. The crown had gained control, but she was beginning to understand the personal price. Charles saw the change in numbers before he felt it in people. Staff who once exchanged informal updates now had to record who authorized sensitive information before passing it beyond the approved circle. That requirement mattered because it turned private briefings into accountable decisions rather than casual habits. The royal calendar, the planned schedule of official engagements carried out by working royals, had already produced one difficult dispute under the new system. This time, the disagreement stayed contained. The king had proof the policy worked. Camilla discovered the cost the next morning. She entered her private office expecting the familiar summary that normally gathered small developments from across the household. It was missing. She asked why, and an aide quietly explained that the material now required central authorization before it could reach her desk. The queen consort did not argue. She simply nodded. But when the aide left, she sat alone, staring at the unusually empty desk, and realizing that something more than paperwork had changed. Charles received a second report later that day through his private office. Unauthorized circulation of sensitive material had dropped sharply since the directive took effect. The result should have felt like victory. Instead, the monarch read another line. Morale inside several offices had become strained. Staff were more cautious, conversations shorter, and family members less certain what they could safely say. The king had stopped the leak culture, but he was beginning to see the danger of replacing disorder with distance. Camilla felt that distance most personally. She had not lost rank, access to her husband, or her formal role, but the rhythm around her had changed enough to feel isolating. Charles understood that if he ignored that pain, the directive might protect the crown while damaging the marriage beneath it. For both of them, the silence now carried a different meaning. So the king chose not to weaken the rule. He chose something harder. He asked Camilla to meet him privately, without aides between them, not as sovereign and queen, but as husband and wife. The crown had made its decision. Now Charles had to discover whether their marriage could survive the way that decision had been made. After days of directives, briefings, and carefully controlled conversations, Charles finally did something no palace rule could accomplish. He closed the institutional distance. No secretaries sat beside him. No papers separated them. No advisor translated one person's concerns for the other. Charles and Camilla spoke alone, and for the first time since the crisis began, the argument was no longer about communications policy. It was about what each feared the other had stopped believing about them. Charles arranged the conversation for the evening and made one thing clear from the start. This was not another review of procedure. The king left the directive elsewhere because he wanted no document sitting between them, no formal language turning emotion into policy. Camilla arrived expecting another defense of the new system, but she quickly understood that something had changed. The queen consort had spent days reading silence as judgment. Now she was finally going to hear what her husband had refused to say before. Charles spoke first. He told her the order had never been designed to humiliate her or weaken her place beside him. The monarch admitted that keeping the final wording private had protected the decision from lobbying, influence, and family pressure, but it had also created another kind of damage. By excluding Camilla from the final discussion, he had made her feel blindsided. That mattered, because trust inside a marriage could not survive forever on assumptions any more than trust inside the royal household could. Camilla answered with the pain she had kept controlled. She told him losing informal access had never been the deepest wound. What hurt was believing that Charles might privately connect her with disloyalty after everything they had survived together. The Queen had accepted criticism, scrutiny, and years of public pressure. What she could not easily accept was the thought that her husband might see betrayal where she believed there had only been loyalty. Charles finally gave her the reassurance he had withheld. According to their private recorded conversation, he told her plainly that he did not believe she had deliberately betrayed him. Camilla went quiet, then admitted something equally important. The old palace culture had become impossible to defend. Personal trust, she accepted, could no longer replace a system where responsibility was clear and information could be traced. That changed everything. Charles would keep the directive exactly where it stood, but he would personally explain its purpose to the senior family and end the resentment growing in silence. The private wound was beginning to heal, yet the king's bold move had already escaped the palace walls, and outside, the country was preparing its own verdict. When the outside world finally understood that something fundamental had changed inside the royal household, the story exploded. It was no longer merely about gossip. Commentators saw discipline, critics saw control. Supporters saw a king finally drawing a line beneath years of damaging palace whispers. And one image captured the entire mood. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, while newspaper stands carried the same question in different forms. Had Charles just ended the era in which private royal tensions could become public entertainment overnight? Charles had wanted to control private information, not create another spectacle. Yet the scale of public attention changed the meaning of his decision almost immediately. The monarchy, meaning the institution built around the sovereign and the working royal family, was suddenly being judged on whether it could protect private disagreements without turning secrecy into suspicion. Palace staff kept their response disciplined. They refused to describe the directive as a fight between Charles and Camilla, and they avoided giving individual offices blame or credit. That restraint mattered, because one careless explanation could have reopened the very culture the king was trying to end. William read the morning headlines with growing concern. The prince supported stronger boundaries, but he could see how quickly a structural reform was being turned into a story about his father's marriage. He understood the danger. If the public believed Camilla had been personally targeted, the order would look less like discipline and more like punishment. The future king wanted the family to hold its nerve, because any defensive reaction could feed the narrative they were trying to stop. Camilla responded differently. She read the coverage without anger and then set it aside. When an aide asked whether her office should push back against the harsher interpretations, the Queen Consort refused. She said the only answer that mattered now was how the family behaved. That quiet acceptance marked a sharp change from the shock she had felt when the directive first landed on her desk. Outside, one front page captured the public mood with brutal simplicity. The king closes the door. The headline sat beneath Buckingham Palace gates, while a small crowd gathered nearby and broadcasters debated whether Charles had permanently changed the way royal information moved. Public reaction proved more supportive than some courtiers expected. Many appeared less interested in palace personalities than in the idea that private family arguments should stop becoming anonymous entertainment. Charles watched the coverage briefly, then switched it off. The king had heard Britain's reaction. Now he was preparing to face the senior family and explain the decision in his own words. The public had delivered its verdict, but the judgment that mattered most was waiting inside the palace. In the end, the boldest part of Charles's decision was not that he silenced palace gossip. It was that he accepted the cost of doing it. Camilla had been hurt. William had been pulled into an uncomfortable family divide. Trusted staff had lost freedoms they assumed would always exist. Yet the king refused to retreat. Instead, he did something harder. He defended the boundary, acknowledged the pain it caused, and rebuilt the trust around it. That became the true meaning of the moment. Charles gathered the senior family and made his position unmistakable. The confidentiality directive, an internal rule controlling how sensitive royal information could be shared, was staying. The king told them it was not punishment, retaliation, or a weapon aimed at one household. He argued that the monarchy could not ask the public to respect private family boundaries while allowing conversations inside the palace to move casually from office to office. Discipline, he insisted, had to begin behind the doors of the institution itself. Camilla sat across from him as the meeting reached its most personal moment. Charles closed his notes, looked directly toward her, and said the rule protected every member of the family equally, including her. The Queen Consort did not answer immediately. William watched the exchange and understood what his father had finally achieved. The monarch had chosen neither his wife nor the next generation over the other. He had chosen a structure meant to stop their differences from being turned into weapons against them. Camilla then gave the decision its final emotional weight. In that private family meeting, she stated clearly that she supported the new arrangement. Her shock had not vanished because the restrictions were easy to accept. It had faded because Charles had finally separated the directive from any suggestion of personal betrayal. The Queen understood that the old system had allowed too much ambiguity, too many selective retellings, and too many opportunities for ordinary disagreements to become something harsher. Charles had not eliminated gossip by demanding perfect loyalty. He had weakened it by removing the informal pathways that allowed it to spread without accountability. That became his real victory. The king emerged not triumphant over Camilla, but clearer about his responsibility. She emerged stunned at first, yet not defeated. Their relationship survived because the conflict ended with explanation rather than accusation. The whispers had forced Charles to choose between avoiding pain and enforcing order. He chose order, accepted the pain, and repaired what the decision had strained. Camilla understood where she stood. William understood what his father was protecting, and the crown moved forward with one final lesson. Loyalty still mattered deeply, but royal trust would now have boundaries. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.